Hey there. Tonight we're sailing back over 500 years to step aboard the wooden decks of Christopher Columbus's ships as they cut through unknown waters toward what they hoped would be the Indies. But this isn't the sanitized version from your history books. This is the real story of cramped quarters, rotten food, and men who signed up for glory but found themselves trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea. If slow immersive history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's out there sharing these quiet moments of discovery. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're heading back to 1492 to the wooden world of the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, where every creak of timber and splash of salt spray carried the weight of history in the making. You wake before dawn to the sound of the ship's bell cutting through the salt air like a rusty knife. There's no snooze button here, no gentle morning routine. Just the harsh clang of metal telling you that another day of survival has begun. Your hammock, if you're lucky enough to have one, is strung up in the cramped space below deck alongside dozens of other men. The air is thick, stale, and heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet wood, and something that might charitably be called breakfast cooking in the galley. The space you sleep in wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to pack as many men as possible into the smallest area while still leaving room for supplies, water barrels, and the rats that have made themselves permanent passengers on this voyage. Your hammock sways with every roll of the ship, and you've learned to sleep through the constant motion, the snoring of your shipmates, and the occasional crash of waves against the hull that sends spray through the gaps in the planking. Rolling out of your hammock is an art form. Too fast and you'll crash into the man next to you. Too slow and you'll miss the morning rations. Your feet hit the deck and immediately you feel the ship's movement in your bones. Even after weeks at sea, some men still haven't found their sea legs. You can hear them retching over the side, adding their own contribution to the ocean that stretches endlessly in every direction. Above deck, the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the horizon, it's the wind. Constant, relentless, carrying the spray of salt water that will coat everything you own before this voyage is over. The deck is slick with moisture and you learn quickly to watch your footing. A fall here doesn't mean embarrassment, it means injury or death. And Columbus isn't turning around to fish you out of the Atlantic. The ship creaks and groans like a living thing. Every piece of wood, every rope, every nail is under constant stress from the wind and waves. You begin to understand that this vessel isn't just your transportation, it's your entire world. Everything you need to survive the next few months is contained within these wooden walls. And if something goes wrong, if the ship breaks apart or runs aground, there's nowhere to run. The morning routine begins with checking the rigging, the complex network of ropes and sails that keeps the ship moving. This isn't work for landlubbers. You're climbing rope ladders 50 feet above the deck while the ship pitches and rolls beneath you. Your hands are already raw from handling the rough hemp rope, and they'll only get worse as the voyage continues. Every day brings new cuts, new splinters, new burns from the friction of ropes sliding through your grip. But this is your life now. No longer the solid ground of Spain beneath your feet. No longer the familiar sights and sounds of home. Just the endless expanse of ocean, the creaking of wood, and the constant knowledge that you're sailing towards something completely unknown. Columbus may have his charts and his confidence, but you're beginning to understand that nobody really knows what lies ahead. The morning meal, such as it is, consists of hardtack and whatever thin gruel the ship's cook has managed to create from the dwindling supplies. Hardtack is exactly what it sounds like. Hard biscuits that are more like edible rocks than actual food. You learn to soak them in water or wine to make them chewable. And you learn not to look too closely at the things moving around inside them. Weevils are just extra protein, you tell yourself, and you're grateful for any protein you can get. The gruel is made from whatever grain stores remain, boiled with salt water to stretch it as far as possible. It's thin, tasteless, and barely warm, but it's food, and food is survival. You eat it quickly, not because you're hungry for more, but because the sooner you finish, the sooner you can get back to work. There's always work to be done on a ship, and idle hands are a luxury no one can afford when you're weeks away from the nearest land. Water is precious beyond measure. Each man gets a daily ration that has to last for drinking, cooking, and whatever washing can be managed. The water is stored in wooden barrels that have been sitting in the ship's hold for weeks, and it tastes accordingly, stagnant, wooden, with a faint green tinge that makes you wonder what's growing in it. But it's water, and without it, you're dead, so you drink it and try not to think about what might be swimming around in there with it. Wine is safer than water, they say, and it's rationed out carefully. Not enough to get drunk, just enough to kill whatever might be lurking in the liquid. The wine has gone sour weeks ago, but sour wine is still better than dying of thirst. You learn to appreciate its sharp bite, and you learn to make it last. Some men try to save their rations, but that's a dangerous game. Discipline is harsh on Columbus's ships, and hoarding supplies can earn you a flogging or worse. As the sun climbs higher, the real work begins. The sails need constant adjustment as the wind changes direction and strength. The deck needs to be swabbed clean of salt spray and whatever else has accumulated overnight. The rigging needs to be checked for wear and tear that could spell disaster in a storm. Every rope, every knot, every piece of equipment is inspected and maintained because your life depends on it. The officers bark orders from the quarterdeck, and you learn quickly to jump when they call. This isn't a democracy, it's a floating dictatorship where Columbus's word is law and questioning his decisions can get you clapped in irons. The hierarchy is clear and absolute. Columbus at the top, his officers below him, the sailors in the middle, and the cabin boys at the bottom. Everyone has their place, and stepping out of line has consequences. You're beginning to understand that this voyage is as much about surviving your fellow sailors as it is about surviving the ocean. Tempers run short in the confined space of the ship, and conflicts that would be minor disagreements on land can explode into violence when there's nowhere to escape. Men fight over food, over sleeping space, over imagined slights, and sometimes just because the stress of the voyage has pushed them past their breaking point. The day stretches on endlessly. There are no clocks marking the hours, just the position of the sun and the rhythm of the ship's bell. Time becomes fluid, measured not in minutes and hours, but in watches and weather. You work when there's work to be done. You eat when food is distributed, and you sleep when exhaustion finally overwhelms you. The normal rhythms of life on land are forgotten, replaced by the eternal cycle of wind, wave, and wooden deck. And always, always, there's the ocean, stretching out in every direction as far as the eye can see, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Sometimes it's calm and almost peaceful, reflecting the sky like a vast mirror. Other times it's angry with waves that tower over the ship and winds that threaten to tear the sails apart. You learn to read its moods, to sense when the weather is changing, to feel in your bones when a storm is approaching. But most of all, you learn to respect it. The ocean doesn't care about your hopes or fears or dreams of golden glory. It doesn't care if you're Spanish or Italian, or if you believe you're sailing toward the Indies or toward the edge of the world. It's indifferent to your survival, and that indifference is perhaps the most frightening thing of all. You're completely at its mercy, and you're beginning to understand just how small and vulnerable you really are. As the first day aboard Columbus's ships draws to a close, you realize that everything you thought you knew about sailing, about adventure, about discovering new worlds, was just romantic imagination. The reality is harsh, uncomfortable, and dangerous. But you're here now, committed to this voyage whether you like it or not, and the only way forward is across the endless expanse of water that separates you from whatever lies on the other side. The work never truly ends aboard Columbus's ships, but it does shift with the rhythm of the day and night. As evening approaches, the immediate tasks of sail handling and deck maintenance give way to the longer, more tedious jobs that keep the ship functioning. You might find yourself assigned to help the ship's carpenter, checking for leaks in the hull and plugging them with whatever materials are available. Water coming in is an emergency that requires immediate attention, because a ship that can't stay afloat is a ship full of dead men, or perhaps you're sent to help with the endless task of maintaining the rigging. Every rope on the ship is subject to constant stress from wind and weather, and they stretch, fray, and sometimes snap without warning. Splicing rope is an art form that you learn quickly out of necessity. Your fingers become nimble with knots and joints because a poorly maintained line could mean the loss of a sail, or worse, the loss of the ship itself. The ship's cook, working in a space barely large enough for one man, somehow manages to prepare meals for the entire crew. It's not cooking in any sense you'd recognize from land. It's more like controlled rationing, stretching whatever supplies remain into something that will keep the men alive for another day. You might be assigned to help him, peeling what vegetables haven't yet rotted, grinding grain for the morning gruel, or simply keeping the cooking fire from spreading to the rest of the ship. Fire is both essential and terrifying aboard a wooden vessel. The cook's fire is carefully contained in a brick-lined box, but even so, everyone is constantly alert for sparks or flames that might catch hold of the dry wood and rigging. A fire at sea is often a death sentence because there's nowhere to run and no fire brigade to call for help. You learn to move carefully around any open flame, and you learn to sleep lightly when the wind is high and the ship is rolling heavily. As darkness falls, the ship doesn't stop moving, but the work does shift to the essential tasks of navigation and watch-keeping. Someone must always be at the helm, steering the ship according to the course Columbus has set. Someone must always be watching the horizon for signs of land for other ships or for weather that might threaten the vessel. The night watches are long and often lonely, but they're also peaceful in their own way. Just you, the ship, and the endless ocean under a canopy of stars brighter than any you've ever seen on land. Navigation is still more art than science in Columbus's time. There are no GPS systems, no radio beacons, no detailed charts of the waters you're crossing. Columbus has his compass, his astrolabe, and his dead reckoning. But much of the navigation depends on experience, intuition, and prayer. You watch him taking measurements of the sun and stars, consulting his charts, and making calculations that will determine where the ship goes next. But you also see the uncertainty in his eyes, the knowledge that he's sailing into the unknown with only his best guess to guide him. The crew settles into the rhythm of shipboard life as the weeks pass. Men who were strangers when they left Spain begin to form the tight bonds that come from shared hardship and mutual dependence. You learn who you can trust in a crisis, who will share his last biscuit when supplies run low, and who might try to take more than his fair share when no one is watching. These relationships become crucial as the voyage continues and the stress of the unknown begins to wear on everyone's nerves, but there are also growing tensions. Some of the men are beginning to question Columbus's leadership, wondering if he really knows where he's going or if he's leading them all to their deaths in the middle of the ocean. Whispered conversations in the dark corners of the ship hint at mutiny, at the possibility that the crew might take matters into their own hands if land doesn't appear soon. Columbus seems aware of these undercurrents, and his discipline becomes harsher as the voyage continues. The food situation grows more desperate with each passing day. What had seemed like adequate supplies when you left Spain now looks pitifully small against the vastness of the ocean. Portions are cut again and again until you're surviving on barely enough to keep you functional. The hardtack is mostly weevils now, and the water has developed a thick green scum that you try not to look at as you drink. Some men are showing signs of scurvy, their teeth loosening and their old wounds reopening as their bodies begin to break down from malnutrition. Yet somehow you adapt. The human capacity for endurance is remarkable, and you find yourself capable of surviving on less food, less water, and less comfort than you would have thought possible. Your body grows lean and hard from the constant work and meager rations. Your hands develop thick calluses that protect them from the rough rope and splintered wood. Your sea legs become so natural that solid ground, when you finally reach it, will feel strange and unsteady beneath your feet. The ocean becomes your entire world. You begin to notice subtleties in its behavior that would have escaped you as a landlubber. The way the waves change pattern when the wind shifts, the different colors of the water that might indicate shallow areas or different currents, the behavior of seabirds that might suggest land is near, even when it's still below the horizon. You become a student of wind and weather because understanding these forces might mean the difference between life and death. And always, there's the waiting for land to appear, waiting for the wind to change, waiting for the next meal, the next watch, the next day. Time moves differently at sea, flowing like the waves themselves, sometimes fast and sometimes achingly slow. Days blur together into an endless sequence of work, watch, eat, sleep, repeat. The only markers are the changes in weather and the gradual deterioration of the ship's supplies and equipment. You're no longer the person who stepped aboard in Spain all those weeks ago. The sea has changed you, hardened you, taught you lessons about survival and endurance that no amount of time on land could have provided. You've learned to live with uncertainty, with discomfort, with the constant knowledge that death is just one storm, one mistake, one piece of bad luck away. But you've also learned that you're capable of more than you ever imagined, that you can endure hardships that would have seemed impossible from the safety of dry land. The voyage continues day after day, week after week, carrying you inexorably toward whatever lies ahead. Whether it's the Indies that Columbus believes he's sailing toward or something else entirely, you'll face it together with these men who have become your brothers in suffering and survival. The ship creaks and groans around you. The ocean stretches endlessly in all directions. And somewhere beyond the horizon, history is waiting to be made. But for now, there's just the next watch, the next meal, the next day of survival in this wooden world between the sea and sky. You've learned that adventure isn't glory and excitement. It's persistence and endurance and the quiet courage to keep going when everything seems hopeless. And as you settle into your hammock for another night of restless sleep, you realize that whatever happens next, you'll face it as a different person than the one who first stepped aboard Columbus's ship with dreams of gold and glory dancing in your head. The reality of sailing with Columbus is that glory is earned one miserable day at a time, through blisters and hunger and the constant fear that the next sunrise might be your last. But somehow, impossibly, you keep sailing toward tomorrow, trusting in Columbus's vision and your own stubborn refusal to give up. Because in the end, that's all any of you have, the determination to see what lies beyond the next wave, the next day, the next horizon in this vast and indifferent ocean that has become your home. By the 1080s, Columbus had survived disease, seasickness, and the grinding daily routine of life aboard the Santa María. The novelty of the voyage had long since worn away, replaced by something harder and more enduring, the steady rhythm of survival. Each morning brought the same calculations, the same quiet negotiations with hunger and thirst, the same careful rationing of hope. The crew had developed their own unspoken hierarchy of endurance. Some men seemed to thrive on the uncertainty, their bodies adapting to the role of the ship, their minds finding comfort in the repetitive tasks. Others wilted visibly, growing thinner and quieter with each passing week. You learned to read the signs, who was hoarding biscuit crumbs, who had stopped laughing at the bosun's jokes, who stared too long at the horizon with eyes that had given up expecting land. Columbus himself remained a figure of distant authority, appearing on deck to take readings with his astrolabe or consult his charts. The crew watched him carefully for signs of doubt or desperation, but he had mastered the art of appearing certain even when uncertainty gnawed at him. His confidence, whether genuine or performed, became another form of ration, distributed in measured doses through his interactions with the officers. The ship's routine had evolved into something almost religious in its precision. Dawn brought the changing of the watch, the checking of lines, the first meal of hardtack and watered wine. Midday meant navigation, the careful noting of speed and direction. the endless guessing at their position on a map that showed only empty ocean. Evening brought repairs, storytelling, and the kind of exhausted camaraderie that develops among men who have no choice but to depend on each other. But beneath this routine lay a growing tension that no amount of discipline could entirely suppress. The promised 33 days had stretched into 40, then 50, then beyond counting. The Indies, which had once seemed like a destination, now felt like a legend, something that existed only in Columbus's charts and the fevered imagination of men too long at sea. Some nights, when the wind died and the ship sat motionless on water as black as ink, you could hear it in the silence between the creaking of timbers, the collective holding of breath, the unspoken question that hung over everything. What if there was nothing out there? What if they had sailed past the edge of the known world into a void that would claim them all? Yet even in those moments of deepest doubt, something kept them going. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, the human refusal to surrender when surrender meant certain death. Perhaps it was the faint but persistent hope that tomorrow's dawn might reveal a different horizon. Or perhaps it was the understanding shared but never spoken that they had become something together that none of them could have been alone. Witnesses to the impossible, sailors beyond the edge of maps, men who had chosen to follow the compass needle into whatever lay beyond the sunset. The ocean had tested them in every way it knew how. It had frozen them and burned them, starved them and sickened them, isolated them and pressed them together until individual identity nearly dissolved into the collective struggle to survive. But they endured day after day, watch after watch, holding their course toward a horizon that revealed nothing but the promise of another day exactly like the one before. And in that endurance, something remarkable had taken root, not glory or gold or the favor of kings, but something more fundamental. The knowledge that ordinary men faced with extraordinary circumstances could find within themselves reserves of strength they never knew existed. The voyage had stripped away everything comfortable and familiar, leaving only what was essential. And what was essential, it turned out, was enough. Life aboard Columbus's ships in 1492 had been a test of endurance, and by now, even the hardiest souls were feeling the strain. But as autumn settled over the Atlantic, something else began to stir beneath the surface of daily survival. Doubt. Not the quiet uncertainty that had always lurked in corners, but something sharper, more dangerous. A creeping suspicion that perhaps their captain had led them not toward the Indies, but toward the edge of the world itself. The doubt started small, whispered in the cramped quarters below deck where men huddled together for warmth. It began with questions that had no good answers. How much further could they possibly sail? The provisions, carefully rationed though they were, wouldn't last forever. The water barrels, despite constant monitoring, were showing signs of running low. And the ocean, that endless expanse of blue that had seemed so promising weeks ago, now felt like a prison with no walls and no doors. Columbus himself felt the weight of these unspoken fears. He could see it in the way conversations stopped when he approached, in the sidelong glances exchanged between crew members, in the way certain sailors no longer met his eyes when he gave orders. The captain's confidence, once so infectious, now seemed to some like the delusion of a madman. After all, what sane navigator would sail this far into the unknown based on calculations that grew more questionable with each passing day? The murmuring began in earnest during the evening meals, when exhausted men gathered around their meager rations and spoke in low voices about home. They talked about families they might never see again, about the solid ground of Spain that now seemed like a distant dream. Some wondered aloud whether they should turn back while they still had enough provisions to make the return journey. Others, more desperate, whispered of taking matters into their own hands. But mutiny was a dangerous word even when spoken in whispers. The penalty for rebellion at sea was death, and Columbus commanded not just through navigational skill, but through the authority granted by the Spanish crown. Still, authority meant little when faced with men who believed they were sailing toward their doom. The tension was palpable, thick as the salt air that clung to everything aboard the ships. Columbus, ever the politician as much as the explorer, began to employ new strategies to maintain order. He started sharing false readings from his charts, making the distance traveled seem shorter than it actually was, hoping to preserve morale. He spoke frequently of the signs that land was near, the birds they spotted, the occasional piece of driftwood, the subtle changes in watercolor that only an experienced mariner would notice. Whether these signs were real or imagined hardly mattered. What mattered was keeping hope alive in the hearts of men who had begun to lose faith. Yet even as he worked to calm his crew, Columbus himself wrestled with private doubts. In the quiet hours of night watch, when the only sounds were the creaking of wood and the endless whisper of waves, he found himself questioning the wisdom of his enterprise. The calculations that had seemed so certain in the comfort of Spanish courts now felt fragile against the reality of this vast, seemingly endless ocean. Had he miscalculated the size of the Earth? Were the ancient geographers wrong about the distance to the Indies, or worse, was he simply lost, leading 3 ships full of men into oblivion? The crew's discontent manifested in small acts of defiance. Orders were followed more slowly than before. The singing that had once helped pass the long hours grew sporadic and eventually stopped altogether. Men who had shared jokes and stories now worked in sullen silence, each lost in his own fears and regrets. The communal spirit that had sustained them through the early weeks of the voyage was fracturing, replaced by an every-man-for-himself mentality that made even the simplest tasks more difficult. Sleep became elusive for many. The close quarters that had once provided comfort now felt claustrophobic, filled with the restless movements of men who could find no peace. Dreams, when they came, were often nightmares of endless sailing, of ships falling off the edge of the world, of slow starvation under a merciless sun. Some men began to show signs of what we might now recognize as psychological stress: trembling hands, sudden outbursts of anger, periods of listless staring at the horizon. The captains of the other 2 ships, Martín Alonso Pinzón of the Pinta and Vicente Yáñez Pinzón of the Niña, found themselves caught between loyalty to Columbus and responsibility to their own crews. They had their own doubts about the wisdom of continuing, but they also understood the consequences of open rebellion. During the brief moments when the ships came close enough for communication, tense conversations passed between the vessels, each captain trying to gauge the mood and intentions of the others. Food became another source of tension. While still adequate, the rations were monotonous and increasingly stale. The hardtack had grown so hard it required soaking in water or wine to be edible, and even then it was often riddled with weevils. The preserved meat had taken on an unpleasant taste, and the water, though carefully conserved, had developed a brackish flavor that reminded everyone of how long they had been at sea. Hunger wasn't yet a critical problem, but the psychological impact of poor food on already stressed men was significant. The weather, too, seemed to turn against them. October brought stronger winds and rougher seas, making life aboard the ships even more uncomfortable. Waves crashed over the decks with increasing frequency, soaking everything and everyone. The constant dampness made it impossible to stay dry, and many men developed rashes and sores from their wet clothing chafing against salt-encrusted skin. Sleep became even more difficult as the ships pitched and rolled through the increasingly turbulent waters. Yet perhaps the most insidious enemy was not hunger or weather or even fear, but boredom. The endless routine of shipboard life, broken only by the occasional excitement of spotting a bird or adjusting the sails, wore down the men's spirits as surely as the salt water wore down the ship's hulls. There were only so many times a man could mend the same piece of rope, only so many games of dice to be played with the same companions, only so many stories to be told and retold. The mind, deprived of stimulation and variety, began to turn inward, feeding on its own fears and doubts. Religious observance, which had been a source of comfort and routine in the early days of the voyage, now took on a more desperate quality. Prayers were said not just from habit, but from genuine fear, as men sought divine intervention to deliver them from their predicament. Some began to see omens and signs in everything: the flight patterns of seabirds, the color of the sunset, the shape of clouds on the horizon. Superstition flourished in the fertile ground of uncertainty and fear, and through it all, Columbus maintained his outward confidence, even as he privately struggled with the weight of responsibility for the lives of nearly 90 men. He knew that the success or failure of the expedition rested not just on his navigational skills, but on his ability to hold together a crew that was slowly coming apart at the seams. The next few days would test not only their physical endurance, but their collective will to continue sailing into the unknown. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and terrible, holding either the fulfillment of their dreams or the destruction of their hopes. The relentless voyage had worn them all down to bone and sinew, to the raw core of what it meant to endure. As the weeks bled into months, Columbus's 3 ships had become floating testaments to human stubbornness, creaking wooden capsules of hope and desperation drifting across an ocean that seemed to have no end. You could see it in the way men moved now. Slower, more deliberate, as if every step required negotiation with muscles that had forgotten what solid ground felt like. The rolling, pitching motion of the ship had become so constant that walking in a straight line felt like a distant memory from another life. Your legs had adapted to the endless sway, but your mind hadn't. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the groaning of timber, the snap of sails, or the sound of someone retching over the side. The food situation had gone from bad to something approaching biblical. The hardtack, once merely stale, now crawled with weevils that had to be picked out grain by grain. The salt pork had turned a suspicious shade of green, and the water barrels held a liquid that tasted more like liquid wood than anything meant for human consumption. Men chewed slowly, not savoring flavor. There was none, but making each bite last, knowing it might be hours before the next one. Disease had become a constant companion, silent and patient. Scurvy was claiming men slowly, their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening, their skin taking on a pallor that spoke of internal collapse. Others suffered from dysentery that left them weak and humiliated, curled in corners of the ship trying to maintain some shred of dignity while their bodies betrayed them. The ship's surgeon, such as he was, could do little more than offer prayers and what passed for comfort, and still the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The same rolling swells, the same empty horizon, the same mocking dance of light on water that promised nothing and delivered less. Birds had stopped appearing weeks ago. Floating debris that might indicate land had vanished. Even the dolphins that had once played alongside the ship seemed to have abandoned them to their fate. The crew's mood had shifted again, settling into something darker than despair. A kind of grim acceptance that felt almost peaceful. They no longer spoke of mutiny or of turning back. Those conversations belonged to men who still believed in alternatives. Now they simply went through the motions of sailing, hauling ropes, and adjusting sails with the mechanical precision of the damned. Columbus himself had become a figure of almost supernatural determination, standing at the bow for hours at a time, scanning the horizon with eyes that refused to accept defeat. His certainty had become their anchor, the one thing preventing the entire expedition from dissolving into chaos. But even his confidence had taken on a harder edge, a quality that suggested he understood the stakes better than anyone dared admit. The nights were the worst. When darkness fell and the ocean became an invisible presence pressing against the hull, men would gather in small groups and speak in whispers about home, about families they might never see again, about the lives they'd left behind for this impossible dream. Some prayed, others simply stared into the darkness and wondered if morning would bring anything different. Yet something remarkable had happened in the depths of their shared suffering. The artificial barriers between officers and crew had begun to dissolve. Rank still mattered for the running of the ship, but when it came to the business of survival, they'd become something like equals. A captain might share his ration with a sick sailor. A common seaman might offer his blanket to an officer shivering with fever. They were no longer Spaniards and Genoese, Christians and conversos. They were simply men, bound together by salt water and stubbornness. The ocean had become their world, complete and inescapable. The life they'd known before seemed like a half-remembered dream. Something that might have happened to other people in another century. The solid earth beneath their feet, the weight of stone buildings, the smell of bread baking in ovens, all of it felt impossibly distant and perhaps fictional, and in that isolation time had begun to behave strangely. Days blended into one another until the calendar became meaningless. Morning and evening were marked not by the activities of civilization, but by the angle of the sun and the color of the water. Some men had stopped counting the days entirely, living instead in an eternal present where the only reality was the next watch, the next meal, the next small task that needed completing. But beneath the exhaustion and the hunger and the creeping despair, something else had taken root. A kind of dark pride in their endurance. A recognition that they had pushed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience and were still moving forward. They had become explorers not just of the ocean, but of the limits of human persistence. Each day they survived was a small victory against the forces trying to break them. The ships themselves had become characters in their story, personalities with moods and quirks that the crew knew intimately. Every creak and groan had meaning. Every shift in the wind brought subtle changes in the vessel's behavior that experienced sailors could read like a language. The Santa María, the Niña, and the Pinta were no longer just tools of transportation. They were homes, shelters, and perhaps tombs carrying their human cargo toward whatever destiny awaited beyond the horizon. And still they sailed on, because there was nothing else to do. The ocean that had seemed so vast and threatening now felt like the only world they'd ever known. And they were its reluctant citizens, bound to it by circumstances beyond their control, and united by a suffering that had stripped away everything except the essential fact of their shared humanity. The ocean that had seemed endless just weeks ago now felt like a prison with liquid walls. The horizon, once a symbol of possibility, had become a cruel joke, always retreating, always empty, always mocking the three ships that crawled across its surface like wounded insects. The Santa María, the Pinta, and the Niña pressed forward through waters that had begun to feel less like a pathway to the Indies and more like a passage to nowhere. Columbus still stood at the bow each morning, scanning the distance with eyes that had grown harder, more desperate. His logbook entries had become exercises in careful deception. He recorded shorter distances than they'd actually traveled, hoping to keep the crew from understanding just how far they'd sailed into the unknown. But the men weren't fools. They could feel it in their bones, the weight of distance, the accumulation of miles that stretched like a chain back to everything familiar. The water barrels, once full and promising, now sloshed with liquid that tasted of wood and desperation. The wine had turned to vinegar weeks ago. The hardtack was riddled with weevils, but the men ate it anyway, picking out the largest insects and pretending not to notice the rest. Food had become a negotiation between hunger and disgust, and hunger was winning. Below deck, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting rope, and the sweet stench of the bilge water that seeped up through the floorboards. Men slept pressed against each other, sharing lice and dreams of solid ground. Some had stopped dreaming altogether. They lay with their eyes open, listening to the endless creak of the ship's timbers, wondering if those groans meant the vessel was holding together or slowly coming apart. The daily routine had become a kind of desperate ritual. Prayers at dawn, not from faith but from habit. The distribution of rations that seemed smaller each day. The endless maintenance, mending sails with thread that was running out, patching holes with wood that was already rotting, pumping water from a bilge that seemed to fill faster than they could empty it. Every task felt like postponing the inevitable rather than ensuring survival. And still Columbus pushed them forward. His certainty had become a kind of madness, beautiful and terrible to witness. He spoke of islands just beyond the horizon, of spices and gold and cities built of marble. The men listened because they had to, but their faces showed nothing. They had moved beyond belief into something else, a kind of hollow endurance that carried them through each day without hope and without despair. The tension was thickest during the night watches. Men stood at the rails staring into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Some claimed they could hear voices in the wind, the calls of loved ones left behind, or perhaps the whispers of men who had sailed these waters before and never returned. Others insisted they saw lights on the horizon, phantom islands that vanished when they pointed them out to their shipmates. The Pinzon brothers, commanding the Pinta and the Niña, had grown quiet in their communications with Columbus. Their signals were shorter, more formal. The easy camaraderie of the early voyage had curdled into something more careful, more measured. They were still following the Admiral's course, but their loyalty had become a thing of duty rather than conviction. Below deck, the conversations had turned darker. Men spoke in whispers of turning back, of forcing Columbus to change course. But these discussions always ended the same way, with the acknowledgement that they were too far from home to turn around. The mathematics of their situation was brutal and simple. They had to go forward because they could no longer go back. The ships themselves seemed to be aging in dog years, ropes that had been strong in Palos now frayed at the slightest tension. Sails that had once billowed proudly now hung in patches, held together with prayers and stubbornness. The Santa María, the largest and supposedly strongest of the three, groaned with every wave, her hull working against itself in ways that made the carpenter cross himself and check the pumps again. Columbus had begun to sleep less. He could be found at all hours pacing the deck, checking the compass, adjusting their heading by degrees that seemed to matter only to him. His hair had grown wild, his clothes stained with salt and sweat, but his eyes still held that fire, that absolute conviction that they were sailing toward destiny rather than disaster. The crew watched him with a mixture of awe and resentment. Some still believed in his vision, caught up in the magnetic pull of his certainty. Others saw him as the architect of their doom, a man whose ambition had carried them all beyond the edge of the known world. But all of them, believers and doubters alike, understood that their fates were tied to his. They would reach land together, or they would die together in the vast indifference of the Atlantic. And so they sailed on, 3 small ships carrying 90 men into a future that none of them could imagine, through waters that had never known the keel of a European vessel, toward a destiny that would reshape the world. Behind them, Spain was a memory. Ahead of them lay only the endless horizon and the stubborn faith of a man who refused to believe that the world could be larger than his dreams. The ocean stretched on, vast and blue and utterly without mercy, carrying its human cargo toward a collision with history that none of them, not even Columbus himself, could truly comprehend. The morning light was different now, not the harsh, unforgiving glare of summer heat that had baked the earth like clay, but something softer, more forgiving. The horizon stretched endlessly before you, painted in shades of gold and amber that seemed to whisper of distant shores and promises you'd never dared to voice. The ship beneath your feet had become as familiar as your own heartbeat, its creaking timber and salt-stained deck now home in ways your village never quite managed to be. You'd been at sea for weeks now, long enough for the initial terror to fade into something resembling acceptance. The endless blue had stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like possibility. Every sunrise brought new waters, new currents, new chances to glimpse something beyond the edge of everything you'd ever known. The other sailors moved with practiced ease, their weathered faces telling stories of storms weathered and horizons chased. You'd learned their rhythms, their superstitions, their quiet songs that carried across the waves when the wind was just right. Columbus himself remained an enigma, pacing the deck with that peculiar mixture of confidence and desperation that marked men who'd staked everything on a dream. He spoke often of gold, of spices, of the great Khan who waited somewhere beyond the sunset. But you'd begun to suspect that what drove him wasn't really treasure or glory. It was the simple, terrible need to be right. To prove that the world was smaller than everyone believed, that the impossible was merely improbable, that faith could triumph over the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The crew's mood had shifted in recent days. The grumbling had quieted, replaced by something harder to name. Not quite hope, but not despair either. A kind of suspended waiting, as if everyone sensed that something was about to change. The birds had returned, first one or two wheeling overhead, then small flocks that seemed to know secrets the wind carried. Pieces of wood had been spotted floating past, carved by tools rather than waves. And yesterday someone had sworn they'd seen a light in the distance, though it vanished before anyone else could confirm it. You stood at the rail, watching the water slip past in patterns that had become as familiar as breathing. The ship rose and fell with the swells, a rhythm that had gotten into your bones until you could no longer imagine sleeping on solid ground. Your hands had grown rough from rope and salt. Your skin burned brown despite the autumn coolness. You were no longer the person who'd left the dock all those weeks ago, driven by desperation and dreams of escape. The sea had changed you, carved you into something new. Behind you, the helmsman called out course corrections in a voice hoarse from salt air and shouted orders. The lookout in the crow's nest scanned the horizon with eyes that had learned to read the difference between cloud shadows and distant land. Everyone knew that these next days would decide everything, whether Columbus was a visionary or a madman, whether you'd all return home as heroes or disappear into legend as cautionary tales about the dangers of sailing too far from the known world. But as you watched the morning light dance across waters that no European had ever seen before, you felt something strange stirring in your chest. Not the fear that had driven you to this ship, not the hunger that had made you willing to risk everything for the promise of gold and glory. Something quieter, deeper, the recognition that you were part of something larger than yourself, caught up in a moment when the world was about to expand beyond anyone's ability to imagine. The unknown stretched ahead like a promise waiting to be kept. And for the first time since leaving port, you found yourself hoping not for a swift return to familiar shores, but for the courage to see what lay beyond the next horizon. Because somewhere out there, past the edge of everything anyone had ever mapped or named or claimed, something was waiting. Something that would change not just your life, but the very shape of the world itself. The wind picked up, filling the sails with purpose, and the ship pressed forward into waters that held their secrets close. Tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps this very evening, those secrets might finally reveal themselves. And when they did, you would be there to witness the moment when the impossible became inevitable, when the world grew larger by becoming smaller, when everything humanity thought it knew about the boundaries of existence would have to be rewritten in the light of discovery. The horizon called and you sailed toward it, no longer running from something but running toward everything you'd never dared to dream possible. The shadows of dawn creep across the harbor, and somewhere in the distance a bell tolls 6 times. You've survived another night, but barely. Your back aches from the straw mattress that's more stone than cushion. Your throat burns from the smoke that never quite clears from your quarters. And your stomach, well, your stomach has been having the same argument with itself for weeks now about whether that last piece of hardtack was worth the risk. You're not the only one awake. Across the cramped quarters, other sailors are stirring, coughing, spitting, cursing the cold. Some have been up all night with the flux. Others with nightmares about storms that haven't come yet. Sleep on a ship like this isn't rest. It's just a brief pause between one form of misery and the next. The Santa María creaks and groans like an old woman's bones. Every timber protests the weight it carries. Every rope stretches against forces it was never meant to bear. Water sloshes somewhere below deck, and you try not to think about whether it's supposed to be there or if the ship is taking on more than it can bail out. You pull yourself upright and immediately your head spins. The air down here is thick enough to chew. A mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, bilge water, and something else you can't quite identify but suspect might be death, lingering just out of sight. Above deck, you can hear the night watch moving about, their footsteps hollow on the wooden planks. Soon it will be your turn to climb those ladder rungs and face whatever the Atlantic has decided to throw at you today. But for now, in these last few minutes before the ship truly wakes, you sit in the half-darkness and wonder, not for the first time, what madness convinced you that sailing into the unknown with Christopher Columbus was anything resembling a good idea. The water barrel beside you is nearly empty again. Your rations have been cut twice this month. The man sleeping next to you hasn't spoken in 3 days, and his breathing sounds like grinding millstones. Somewhere in the distance beyond the endless horizon you can't yet see might be land. Spices gold, a new world, or there might be nothing at all. Just more water, more hunger, more slow dying under a sky that stretches on forever. You close your eyes and try to remember what solid ground feels like under your feet, what bread tastes like when it's fresh, what it's like to sleep in a bed that doesn't pitch and roll with every breath of wind. But those memories are fading now, worn thin by salt air and desperation. There's only the ship, only the endless rocking, only the slow grinding passage of another day that might be your last. The bell tolls again. Time to see if you're strong enough to climb those rungs one more time. The weight of survival pressed down like a stone slab against your chest. You had endured another night, another dawn, another prayer whispered into smoke-filled air. But winter wasn't finished with you yet. As the pale light crept through the gaps in your roof, illuminating the frost that had formed on the inside walls of your hut. You understood that each day was both a victory and a test. Your neighbors emerged from their own battles with the cold, moving like shadows against the gray landscape. Old Thomas hadn't been seen in 3 days. His door remained shut, no smoke rising from his roof. Everyone knew, but no one spoke of it. Death was too familiar a visitor to announce. The village had grown quieter with each passing week, not from peace, but from absence. The stores were nearly gone now. What had seemed like adequate preparation in autumn felt laughably insufficient in the harsh reality of February. You counted your remaining grain not in sacks, but in handfuls. The dried beans had developed a suspicious film. Even the turnips, those reliable companions of hardship, were sprouting soft spots that had to be cut away with increasing frequency. Your children had stopped asking when the hunger would end. They simply accepted the gnawing emptiness as part of existence, like the cold or the darkness. Their eyes had taken on that hollow look you recognized from previous bad years, the look that said the body was beginning to consume itself. You tried not to think about which of your neighbor's children had worn that same expression and never lived to see spring. The animals were suffering too. Your cow's ribs showed through her winter coat, and her milk had dwindled to barely a cup each morning. The chickens huddled together in sullen silence, their egg-laying reduced to an occasional precious offering. You'd already made the calculation in your head, which animals could be sacrificed for meat, and which were too valuable to lose. But even that grim arithmetic offered little comfort. The meat would last perhaps a week, and then what? In the depths of these dark months, you found yourself doing things that would have seemed unthinkable in times of plenty. You boiled leather scraps to make a bitter broth. You ground acorns and bark into a paste that could barely be called flour. You picked through the ashes of the fire, searching for any grain that might have fallen and could be salvaged. Pride had become a luxury you couldn't afford. The church bells still rang, marking the hours with their familiar bronze voices, but even they seemed muted by the cold. Father Benedict's sermons had grown shorter, his breath visible in the frigid air of the chapel. He spoke of Job's trials, of suffering as a test of faith, but his own gaunt cheeks suggested he was being tested alongside his flock. Prayer had become your most constant companion, not the formal recitations of Mass, but the desperate, wordless pleas you whispered while stirring the empty pot, while listening to your child's cough in the night, while lying in the darkness wondering if tomorrow would bring relief or simply more of the same relentless trial. You prayed not for miracles, but for endurance, for the strength to wake up one more time, to face one more day, to keep the embers of hope alive until the world remembered how to be warm again. And yet, even in this bleakest chapter of winter's reign, there were moments of unexpected grace. A neighbor sharing a handful of dried peas. A child's laugh echoing briefly through the cold air. The sight of a bird, somehow still alive, hopping through the snow with stubborn determination. These small lights in the darkness reminded you that survival wasn't just about the body's persistence, but about the soul's refusal to surrender entirely to despair. You had learned to measure wealth differently now. A dry piece of wood was treasure. A day without wind was a blessing. A night when everyone in your house woke up alive was cause for quiet gratitude. The standards of a good life had been stripped down to their most essential elements: warmth, food, breath, and the fragile hope that winter, no matter how merciless, would eventually exhaust itself. As you sat by the dying fire, rationing the last of your fuel as carefully as a miser counts coins, You understood something that those who had never faced such hardship could never comprehend. Survival wasn't noble or heroic. It was simply necessary. And sometimes the greatest act of courage was not some grand gesture of defiance, but the quiet decision to wake up tomorrow and try again, even when every bone in your body ached with cold and every thought in your mind whispered that surrender might be easier. But you didn't surrender. None of you did, because somewhere beneath the ice and snow, beneath the hunger and the fear, lay the promise that spring would return, that the earth would soften again, that green things would grow, that the sun would remember how to warm instead of merely illuminate. You endured because you had no choice, and because choice itself had become a luxury reserved for better times. The winter was winning, yes, but it hadn't won, not yet. And as long as there was still breath in your lungs and fire in your hearth, you would continue the ancient human practice of holding on, one frozen moment at a time, until the world decided to be kind again. You're standing on the deck of the Santa María in the pre-dawn darkness of October 12th, 1492. The air is thick with salt spray and something else, the acrid smell of too many bodies pressed together for too long without proper washing. Your stomach clenches not from hunger this time, though that's always there, but from the constant motion of the ship that never quite lets you find your balance. You've been at sea for over 2 months now, and every sunrise brings the same question whispered among the crew. Will we see land today? Or will we die out here in this endless blue wasteland that Columbus insists will lead to the Indies? The ship creaks around you like an old man's bones, and you pull your threadbare cloak tighter against the morning chill. The deck beneath your bare feet is slick with moisture that could be dew, could be spray, could be something worse. You don't think about it too hard anymore. You've learned not to think about a lot of things. Like how the hardtack in your pouch moves when you're not looking at it. Or how the water in the barrels tastes increasingly of wood and desperation. Or how Rodrigo hasn't spoken in 3 days and just stares at the horizon with eyes that have seen too much empty ocean. Columbus emerges from his cabin, and even in the dim light you can see the tension in his shoulders. He's been promising land for weeks now. Reading signs in every floating piece of seaweed, every shift in the wind patterns, every bird that appears and disappears again. The crew's faith in him wavers like a candle in a storm. Some still believe in his vision of reaching the Orient by sailing west. Others have begun to mutter about mutiny when they think he can't hear. You remember the morning you left Palos, how the whole venture seemed touched by destiny. 3 ships, 90 men, provisions for what Columbus promised would be a journey of a few weeks at most. The Nina, the Pinta, and this flagship, the Santa Maria, cutting through familiar waters toward an unknown horizon. Your mother had pressed a wooden cross into your palm and whispered prayers for your safe return. You wonder now if you'll ever see her weathered face again. The work aboard ship is relentless. There are sails to trim, ropes to mend, watches to stand. Your hands are raw from handling rough hemp lines, and your shoulders ache from hauling on sheets and halyards. The ship never sleeps, and neither, it seems, do you. When you're not working, you're eating your meager rations. Salt pork that's more salt than pork. Beans that crunch between your teeth with weevils. wine that's turned to vinegar but is still safer than the water. At night, packed into the cramped space below deck with your shipmates, the air becomes almost unbreathable. Men snore and mumble in their sleep, calling out names of wives and sweethearts left behind. Someone always has a fever, someone else a cough that echoes in the wooden cave of the ship's belly. You sleep fitfully when you sleep at all, dreaming of dry land and fresh water and food that doesn't fight back. The worst part isn't the physical discomfort, though that's constant. It's the uncertainty that gnaws at you like hunger. Columbus speaks confidently of his calculations, his charts, his divine mission. But you've watched him pace the deck at night when he thinks no one is looking, staring into the darkness as if he could will land into existence through sheer force of belief. And you've heard the whispered conversations among the more experienced sailors, men who've sailed these waters before and know how far you've traveled into the unknown. The supplies are running dangerously low, the water tastes like wood and algae, and there's barely enough for cooking the salt pork and hardtack that make up most of your meals. The wine, which started as a luxury, has become a necessity. Not for pleasure, but because it's safer to drink than the increasingly suspect water. Even so, it's been rationed so strictly that your daily portion barely wets your lips. The Nina and Pinta sail nearby, close enough that you can sometimes hear shouts carried on the wind, but far enough that they seem like ghosts of ships, insubstantial in the morning mist. Captain Pinzon of the Pinta has been growing increasingly vocal about turning back. You've seen him signal to Columbus, watched the animated discussions between the captains when the ships draw close enough for conversation. The tension is visible even at a distance. Your shipmates are changing. Men who started the voyage with jokes and songs now go hours without speaking. Rodriguez, who used to entertain everyone with stories of his adventures in Seville, now sits by himself, staring at his hands. Miguel, the ship's boy, who reminded everyone of their younger brothers, has developed a hollow look in his eyes that makes you want to look away. The cook, Pedro, has taken to muttering prayers over the terrible stew he serves each evening, as if he could bless it into being something edible. But it's the silence that's worst, not the absence of sound. The ship is never truly quiet, with the constant creaking of wood, the slap of waves against the hull, the whistle of wind through the rigging. It's the absence of hope in the voices around you. Men speak in short, clipped sentences about practical matters, adjusting sail, checking the compass heading, distributing rations. No one talks about what they'll do when they reach the Indies anymore. No one talks about the gold Columbus has promised, or the spices, or the glory. The compass readings have been erratic, and Columbus has taken to keeping two sets of logs. One showing the true distance traveled, which he keeps to himself, and another showing a shorter distance, which he shares with the crew to prevent panic. But sailors aren't fools, and many have begun to suspect they've sailed much farther than anyone admits. The stars look wrong, unfamiliar constellations wheeling overhead in patterns that don't match any charts you've ever seen. As the first pale light of dawn spreads across the water, you join the other men gathering on deck for morning prayers. Father Sanchez leads the devotions, his voice steady despite the ship's motion, despite the uncertainty that grips everyone. You bow your head and recite the familiar words, but part of your mind wanders to thoughts of home. The smell of your mother's bread baking, the sound of church bells across the plaza in Palos, the feeling of solid ground beneath your feet. The lookout calls down from the crow's nest, reporting what he sees on the horizon. Always the same, endless water, perhaps a cloud formation that might be land but never is. Sometimes a bird that raises hopes before disappearing again. You've learned not to look up eagerly at these reports anymore. Hope has become a luxury you can't afford, something that hurts too much when it's inevitably disappointed. Columbus orders the course maintained, his voice carrying the authority of command, but also something else. A note of desperation that he tries to hide, but that seeps through anyway. He speaks of providence, of divine guidance, of the certainty that land lies just beyond the horizon. But you notice how his hands shake slightly when he thinks no one is watching. How he grips the ship's rail as if it's the only thing keeping him anchored to his convictions. The sun climbs higher, and the work of the ship continues. Sails are trimmed to catch the changing wind. The deck is swabbed with precious fresh water to prevent the spread of disease. Nets are checked and mended. The routine provides a framework for the day, something to hold on to when everything else seems uncertain. But underneath the routine, the questions multiply like the weevils in the hardtack. How much farther can we go? How much longer can the supplies last? What if Columbus is wrong? What if there's nothing out here but endless ocean? You notice how the other men avoid looking directly at the horizon anymore, as if the sight of empty water has become too painful to bear. Instead, they focus on their work, on the immediate tasks at hand, on anything that doesn't require them to confront the possibility that this voyage might end not in glory and gold, but in slow starvation under an indifferent sky. The ship's cat, a scrawny tabby that's supposed to keep the rats under control, has given up hunting and now spends most of its time sleeping in whatever patch of sunlight it can find. Even the rats seem less active, perhaps conserving energy in the face of dwindling food supplies. Everything aboard the Santa María has taken on a quality of endurance, of simply holding on for one more day, one more watch, one more sunrise. As the morning progresses and the sun beats down on the deck, you seek shade wherever you can find it. The heat reflects off the water and the white sails, creating a glare that makes your eyes water and your head ache. The tar between the deck planks grows soft and sticky, clinging to your bare feet and adding another layer of discomfort to the endless list of small miseries that make up life aboard ship. But there's something different about today. You can't quite put your finger on it at first. Maybe it's the way the wind feels, or a subtle change in the color of the water, or the fact that there seem to be more birds around than usual. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to as definitive proof of anything. Just a feeling, a sense that something is shifting in the vast emptiness that has surrounded you for so long. Columbus feels it too. You can see it in the way he carries himself, the way his eyes search the horizon with renewed intensity. He calls for the lead to be cast, checking the depth of the water beneath the ship. The readings show shallower water than the deep ocean you've been crossing, though still too deep to anchor. It's a sign, perhaps, that land might be near, or it might mean nothing at all. The crew's mood begins to shift slightly as word spreads about the depth readings and the increasing bird sightings. It's not optimism exactly. That's been beaten out of most of you by weeks of disappointment. But there's a cautious stirring of something that might, with luck and prayer, eventually become hope again. Men who haven't spoken much in days begin to exchange quiet words. The lookouts in the crow's nests scan the horizon with renewed attention. You find yourself thinking about what it will mean if you do find land. Will it be the Indies that Columbus has promised? Will there be gold and spices in the route to Cathay that will make you all rich? Or will it be something else entirely, some unknown shore populated by unknown people speaking unknown languages? The uncertainty is almost as frightening as the prospect of never finding land at all. The afternoon watch brings more signs, floating vegetation that looks fresh rather than the old waterlogged seaweed you've been seeing for weeks. A piece of carved wood drifts past the ship, clearly worked by human hands. The water itself seems different, a slightly different shade of blue-green that suggests shallower depths, and perhaps the influence of rivers flowing from some distant shore. As evening approaches, Columbus calls all hands on deck. His face is flushed with excitement, and when he speaks, his voice carries a conviction that's been missing for days. He tells you about the signs, about his certainty that land is near, about the rewards that await those who persevere. He promises a silk doublet to the first man who sights land, in addition to the pension already promised by the Spanish crown. But more than his words, it's his manner that affects the crew. For the first time in weeks, he seems genuinely confident rather than desperately hopeful. Whether this confidence is justified or simply another manifestation of his iron will, you can't say. But it's infectious nonetheless, spreading through the assembled sailors like fever. The night watch is different. Men who usually go below deck as soon as their duties allow remain topside, peering into the darkness, straining their eyes for any sign of the land that Columbus insists is near. The lookouts call down more frequently, reporting lights on the horizon that turn out to be stars, or shapes in the water that resolve into clouds or tricks of moonlight on waves. You stand at the rail listening to the familiar sounds of the ship moving through water, the hiss of foam along the hull, the creak of rigging, the distant voices of your shipmates. But underneath these familiar sounds, you imagine you can hear something else, the sound of waves breaking on a shore somewhere ahead in the darkness. It's probably imagination, probably just another false hope in a voyage that's been full of them. But you listen anyway, straining your ears against the night. The hours pass slowly. Men doze at their posts or pace the deck restlessly, too keyed up to sleep but too exhausted to remain fully alert. The ship sails on through the darkness, carrying its cargo of desperate hope toward whatever waits beyond the horizon. And then, just before dawn, a cry rings out from the Pinta. "Tierra! Tierra! Land! Land!" The word spreads across the water like wildfire, from ship to ship, from man to man. You rush to the rail with everyone else, peering into the pre-dawn gloom, trying to see what the lookout on the Pinta has spotted. There, silhouetted against the lightening sky, is the unmistakable outline of a coastline. Trees, beaches, the solid, blessed reality of dry land. The emotion that sweeps through the crew is indescribable. Grown men weep openly, fall to their knees in prayer, embrace each other like brothers. Some laugh hysterically, others simply stare in stunned silence at the sight they'd begun to believe they would never see. You feel your own eyes filling with tears, though whether from relief, exhaustion, or simple overwhelming gratitude, you can't say. Columbus stands at the bow, his face turned toward the approaching shore, and for a moment he looks less like a navigator and more like a prophet whose vision has finally been vindicated. The weeks of doubt, the whispers of mutiny, the gnawing fear that his calculations were wrong, all of it falls away in the face of that dark line on the horizon that promises salvation. As the sun rises and the light improves, you can make out more details of the approaching land. It's not what anyone expected, not the spice-laden ports of the Indies, not the golden cities of Cathay, but something entirely new. A coastline covered in unfamiliar vegetation, beaches of white sand, and in the distance, smoke rising from what might be cooking fires. The Santa Maria, along with the Nina and Pinta, approaches the shore cautiously. Columbus orders the lead cast continuously, checking the depth as the ships navigate toward what appears to be a suitable landing place. The excitement among the crew is palpable but contained. You've all been at sea long enough to know that approaching an unknown shore requires careful seamanship. As you draw closer, you can see figures on the beach, people who have come to watch these strange vessels approach their shores. They appear to be naked or nearly so, with dark skin and long black hair. Some point at the ships, others run along the beach, keeping pace with your progress. Their voices carry across the water, speaking in a language none of you recognize. Columbus orders the ships to anchor in a protected bay, and preparations are made for going ashore. The admiral dresses in his finest clothes, a red doublet, his sword at his side, the royal banner of Castile and Leon ready to be planted in this new soil. The captains of the other ships row over in their boats, and together you prepare for the moment that will change everything. The boat that carries you toward shore cuts through water so clear you can see the sandy bottom beneath. Fish dart away from the approaching craft, and the water itself seems different from the deep ocean blue you've grown accustomed to. Warmer, more welcoming, alive with possibility and danger in equal measure. Your feet touch solid ground for the first time in over 2 months. And the sensation is almost overwhelming. The beach doesn't move beneath you, doesn't roll or pitch or heave. It's stable, permanent, real in a way that the ship's deck never was. You want to kneel and kiss the sand, to press your face against the earth and breathe in the smell of growing things instead of salt and tar and unwashed bodies. The native people approach cautiously, as curious about you as you are about them. They bring gifts, parrots, balls of cotton thread, wooden spears, and seem eager to trade. Columbus accepts their offerings graciously, but you can see the calculation in his eyes. These people have no iron weapons, no horses, no armor. They could be easily conquered if necessary. But they also seem friendly, even welcoming, which might make conquest unnecessary. You help plant the royal standard in the sand and listen as Columbus formally claims this land for the Spanish crown. But even as the familiar words of possession are spoken, you realize that something fundamental has changed. You've sailed off the edge of the known world and found another world. Not the Indies, not Cathay, but something entirely new and unexpected. The implications are staggering. The geography that scholars have debated for centuries is wrong. The world is larger than anyone imagined. full of lands and peoples that exist in no book, on no map, in no traveler's tale. You're standing on a beach that might as well be on another planet, surrounded by people who have never heard of Spain or Christianity or any of the things that define your world. As you look around at your shipmates, dirty, exhausted, but alive and triumphant, you realize that you've all become something new. You're no longer just sailors or explorers. You're witnesses to the expansion of the world itself, the first Europeans to set foot on shores that will soon be transformed by your presence. The weight of that responsibility, that opportunity, that terrible power settles on your shoulders like a cloak. The journey that brought you here was one of endurance, of holding on through weeks of uncertainty and fear and dwindling hope. But now, standing on this strange beach under an alien sky, you understand that the real journey is just beginning. The months at sea were just the prologue to a story that will reshape both worlds. The one you came from and the one you found. As the small boat scraped against the sandy shore of what would later be called San Salvador, the men who stumbled onto that beach were fundamentally different from those who had departed from Palos just over 2 months earlier. Their bodies bore the marks of their ordeal, skin weathered and cracked by salt spray, muscles weakened by poor nutrition, eyes hollow from sleepless nights spent watching the horizon. But it was the transformation of their minds and spirits that would prove most lasting. The moment their boots touched solid ground, many of the sailors fell to their knees, not just in prayer, but in sheer physical relief. The constant motion that had plagued them for 70 days suddenly ceased. The earth beneath them was still, solid, real. Some wept openly, others kissed the sand, and a few simply stood in stunned silence, hardly believing their ordeal was over. The psychological weight of uncertainty that had pressed down upon them for weeks lifted like a physical burden being removed from their shoulders. Columbus himself, despite his outward composure, was profoundly affected by the landing. His private journals reveal a man overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had gambled everything, his reputation, his life, the lives of his men, on a theory that many considered madness. Now, standing on this foreign shore, he grappled with the reality that he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, though not in the way he had originally envisioned. The indigenous people who approached them on that first day presented a sight that challenged everything these Europeans thought they knew about the world. These were not the spice merchants of the Indies they had expected to encounter, nor the subjects of the great Khan that Columbus had hoped to meet. Instead, they found themselves face to face with peoples whose very existence had been unknown to European civilization. The Taino people who greeted them were curious, generous, and remarkably peaceful, a stark contrast to the battle-hardened sailors who had just endured one of history's most challenging voyages. For the crew members, this first contact was both wondrous and deeply unsettling. They had survived the ocean's fury, conquered their fears, and pushed beyond the edge of their known world, only to discover that the world was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. The gold ornaments worn by some of the natives immediately captured their attention, sparking dreams of wealth that would drive European exploration for centuries to come. Yet there was also an underlying tension, a recognition that they were intruders in a land that belonged to others. The days that followed their landing revealed the true cost of their voyage. Several crew members were too weak to participate in the initial exploration of the islands. The ship's supplies were nearly exhausted, and the men faced the sobering reality that they would need to make the return journey with vessels that had been battered by weeks at sea. The Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria had served them well, but they bore the scars of their Atlantic crossing: weakened timbers, frayed rigging, and hulls that had been repeatedly stressed by the relentless motion of the waves. As Columbus and his men explored the Caribbean islands over the following weeks, they began to understand the magnitude of their discovery. This was not simply a new route to known lands, but an entirely new world. The plants, animals, and peoples they encountered were unlike anything in European experience. Parrots with brilliant plumage, strange fruits that tantalized their taste buds, and trees that seemed to grow in impossible configurations. Everything challenged their understanding of natural history. The psychological impact of these discoveries cannot be overstated. These men had been raised in a world where the limits of human knowledge seemed clearly defined. The Atlantic Ocean was considered an impassable barrier, the edge of the inhabitable world. Now they found themselves walking through forests that no European had ever seen, breathing air that felt different from anything they had known, and communicating through gestures with people whose languages bore no resemblance to any European tongue. Yet even as they marveled at these wonders, the practical concerns of survival remained paramount. The return voyage loomed ahead of them, and they knew it would be no less challenging than their outward journey. They needed to gather supplies, make repairs to their ships, and somehow navigate back across an ocean that had nearly claimed their lives. The knowledge that they had successfully crossed the Atlantic once did little to ease their anxiety about doing so again. The crew's relationship with Columbus also evolved during their time in the Caribbean. The man who had been viewed with suspicion and sometimes hatred during the darkest days of the voyage was now seen in a different light. His unwavering faith in his mission, which had seemed like dangerous obsession during the crossing, now appeared as visionary leadership. The mutinous whispers that had circulated among the crew gave way to grudging respect, though underlying tensions remained. As they prepared for their return journey, the men faced a profound psychological challenge. They had survived an experience that would have broken lesser individuals, discovered lands that would reshape human understanding of the world, and proven that the ocean was not an insurmountable barrier but a highway to new possibilities. Yet they also carried with them the weight of what they had endured, the fear, the hunger, the desperation that had nearly overwhelmed them during those dark weeks at sea. The return voyage, though not without its own perils, would prove somewhat easier psychologically. They now knew that land lay beyond the western horizon, that the Atlantic could be crossed, and that their ships were capable of making the journey. The terror of sailing into the unknown had been replaced by the more manageable anxiety of repeating a difficult but proven route. When they finally reached the familiar shores of Spain in March 1493, the transformation was complete. The men who had departed as ordinary sailors returned as participants in one of history's most significant voyages. They had pushed beyond the boundaries of human knowledge and returned with proof that the world was far larger and more wondrous than anyone had imagined. The impact of their voyage would reverberate through history. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors would follow in their wake, establishing colonies throughout the Caribbean and eventually conquering vast empires on the American mainland. The indigenous peoples they had encountered would face catastrophic changes as European diseases, weapons, and colonial ambitions transformed their world beyond recognition. The age of European expansion had begun, driven by the knowledge that Columbus and his crew had paid for with their suffering and courage. For the individual sailors who had made that first crossing, life would never be the same. They had looked into the abyss of the unknown and emerged transformed. Some would make additional voyages to the New World, drawn by the promise of gold and adventure. Others would remain in Spain, content to live out their days as witnesses to history. But all of them carried within themselves the knowledge of what it meant to push beyond the limits of human endurance and discover that those limits were not as fixed as they had once believed. The ships themselves became symbols of human achievement. The Nina would make several additional voyages to the Americas while the Pinta returned to regular service in European waters. The Santa María, which had run aground on the coast of Hispaniola during the first voyage, left her timbers as the foundation for the first European settlement in the New World. These vessels, which had seemed so fragile during the darkest moments of their Atlantic crossing, had proven themselves capable of carrying human civilization across the greatest ocean barrier on Earth. The voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492 represented more than just a navigational achievement. It was a testament to human endurance, courage, and the willingness to venture into the unknown despite overwhelming odds. The men who participated in that voyage experienced fear, desperation, and suffering that few humans have ever endured. They faced the very real possibility of death by starvation, thirst, or drowning, yet they persevered. Their story reminds us that the great achievements of human history often come at tremendous personal cost. The romantic image of Columbus as a fearless explorer obscures the reality of men pushed to their absolute limits, struggling with doubt, fear, and the very real possibility of failure. It was not fearlessness that drove them forward, but rather the courage to continue despite their fears. The legacy of that voyage continues to shape our world today. The encounter between European and indigenous American civilizations that began with Columbus's landing would transform both continents forever. The consequences of that meeting, both positive and negative, continue to influence global politics, economics, and culture more than 5 centuries later. To sail with Christopher Columbus in 1492 was to participate in one of history's most transformative moments. It meant enduring physical hardship that tested the limits of human endurance, confronting psychological challenges that would have broken many spirits, and ultimately discovering that the world was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. The men who made that voyage paid a price in suffering and sacrifice that can barely be comprehended today. But their courage and perseverance opened a new chapter in human history that continues to unfold even now. As the crew finally set foot on that Caribbean shore, their relief was overwhelming, but their ordeal was far from over. The return journey would prove equally treacherous, and many of those who survived the initial voyage would never see their homeland again. The men who had endured months of uncertainty, hunger, and fear now faced an entirely new set of challenges in this alien world they had stumbled upon. The indigenous people they encountered were nothing like the wealthy Asian merchants Columbus had promised. These were not the spice-laden ports of Cathay or the golden cities of Sipangu. Instead, they found simple communities living in harmony with their environment, people who had no concept of the European hunger for gold and territory that would soon consume their world. The crew's disappointment was palpable, but Columbus remained convinced he had reached the Indies, a delusion that would persist until his death. For the sailors who had survived the crossing, the psychological impact was profound and lasting. Many developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of trauma from their extended period of isolation and terror. The constant fear of death, the claustrophobic conditions, and the uncertainty had fundamentally changed these men. They had stared into the abyss of the unknown ocean and survived, but the experience had marked them permanently. The few who made it back to Spain carried with them more than just tales of new lands. They brought diseases they had never encountered, strange foods and artifacts that would puzzle European scholars for decades. But perhaps most importantly, they carried the knowledge that the world was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. The comfortable medieval worldview where everything had its place and purpose had been shattered by their journey into the void. The ships themselves told their own story of survival. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria had been pushed beyond their limits, their hulls eaten by shipworms, their sails patched and repatched, their rigging held together by prayers and ingenuity. The Santa Maria would never make it home, wrecked on the shores of Hispaniola on Christmas Day. The surviving vessels limped back to Europe like wounded animals barely seaworthy, their crews reduced to shadows of their former selves. What strikes us most about this voyage is not the heroic narrative often told in history books, but the raw human cost of exploration. These were not brave adventurers setting out to discover new worlds. They were desperate men, many fleeing poverty or legal troubles, who found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The romantic notion of age of exploration glosses over the reality of what it meant to be an ordinary sailor in Columbus's fleet. The social dynamics aboard these ships reveal much about the rigid hierarchies of medieval society. The officers ate better food, slept in marginally better quarters, and had access to navigational information that was kept secret from the common sailors. This inequality bred resentment that simmered throughout the voyage, occasionally erupting into near mutiny. The crew's willingness to follow Columbus stemmed not from trust or loyalty, but from the simple fact that they had no alternative. They were literally in the same boat, and their survival depended on his navigation skills, however questionable they might be. The technological limitations of the era meant that every aspect of the voyage was a gamble. Navigation was primitive, weather prediction non-existent, and medical knowledge rudimentary at best. When men fell ill, they either recovered through sheer luck or died in agony. There were no radio communications, no rescue ships, no safety nets of any kind. Once they sailed beyond the horizon, they were utterly alone in a way that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. The food situation deserves special attention because it dominated every aspect of daily life aboard these ships. The gradual transition from fresh provisions to increasingly rotten stores was not just about nutrition. It was about morale, hope, and the psychological state of the crew. When the last of the fresh water turned brackish and the final pieces of cheese grew moldy, it represented more than just dietary hardship. It symbolized their growing distance from everything familiar and safe. Perhaps most remarkably, the crew's experience illustrates the incredible adaptability of human beings under extreme stress. Men who had never been more than a few miles from their birthplace learned to navigate by stars they had never seen, to eat foods that would have revolted them on land, and to find comfort in the smallest pleasures. A favorable wind, a school of dolphins, or simply another day without disaster. The legacy of their suffering extends far beyond their individual stories. The route they pioneered would become a highway for conquest, colonization, and cultural exchange that would reshape both the old world and the new. The diseases they carried would devastate indigenous populations, while the wealth they would eventually extract would transform European society. Their journey marked the beginning of the modern global economy, built on the foundation of their endurance and sacrifice. As the crew stumbled onto that foreign shore, their legs trembling from months at sea, they had no idea they were stepping into a moment that would echo through centuries. The indigenous people who emerged from the tree line faced strangers whose arrival would irrevocably transform their world. Columbus, still convinced he had reached the Indies, began a chain of events that would reshape global trade, spark colonial empires, and alter the course of human civilization. But let's not forget the human cost we've witnessed. Those sailors who survived the journey carried scars that history books rarely mention. The psychological trauma of near starvation, the physical toll of months in cramped quarters, the constant fear of death. These were the true prices of discovery. Many crew members returned to Spain forever changed, haunted by nightmares of endless horizons and the screams of dying shipmates. The voyage we've experienced together reveals a fundamental truth about human achievement. Our greatest breakthroughs often come at extraordinary personal cost. Behind every celebrated discovery lies a trail of suffering, sacrifice, and sheer determination to push beyond the known world. Columbus's journey wasn't just about finding new lands, it was about testing the absolute limits of human endurance. Those 91 men who sailed west into the unknown didn't just discover America. They discovered what people can survive when driven by desperation, hope, and the relentless pull of the horizon. Their story reminds us that history's most pivotal moments are built on the backs of ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardships, forever changing not just maps, but the very fabric of human existence.